Sorry about that. Welcome. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your morning to join us. I hope here on day 3, everyone's holding up well and learning a lot, and look forward to more to come. I'm Brad Weibel. I'm a senior editor at Science Magazine. We're a weekly interdisciplinary journal with global audience spanning all aspects of science, natural science, social science. And several times a year, we pull together a concentrated package on a certain topic. And over the past year, as we looked for things other than COVID to occupy our time with, we decided that the issue of managed retreat, climate-induced relocation would be a good topic to explore in terms of how research can and should be engaging with the process. And I must add that I was inspired to pursue this in part by the conference that Columbia hosted 2 years ago on the same topic. And so over the past 6 months or so, I've had the pleasure of working with all the people who you're about to hear speak, along with many of their co-authors, and also want to acknowledge other external reviewers who helped provide very valuable feedback to improve the process and the product. And we thought it'd be good to give our platform at Science that we've been fortunate to earn over many years to help elevate awareness of these issues to people who may not otherwise, really dig deeply into this. And so we hope that we've provided a useful package spanning a whole range of research disciplines and topics, and also putting it in very critical context. And so we thought it would be useful to pull the authors together and have them talk to you a little bit about what they said in the magazine, but we don't want to lecture at you too much. So each person's going to talk for about maybe 4 or 5 minutes, just to give an overview of just the take-home points of what they mentioned. And then we're going to have plenty of time for the group to do some discussion and questions. And then, of course, we will open it up at the end for questions from the group. So I think that's about it. So I'm going to stop now. And to get us started here, we're going to hand it over to Catherine. And here we go.
Great, thank you so much, Brad. And I think as we've all been thinking over the last few days, listening to the remarkable sessions, retreat, relocation, displacement, these are not abstract concepts, they're experiences happening now. And really where we picked up in our research review was the fact that, retreat to date at best has been politically perilous, the option of last resort. And at worst, it's been traumatic and destructive for communities. So what we do in this research review is really contemplate, could retreat be something different as we move forward and build from our experiences to date? This funky diagram in some ways sums up what we've done. We ask, for example, what would it take for retreat to be different from the past? Probably that requires retreat being much more proactive, not just something that happens in a context of emergency, but deliberately, slowly, and inclusively moving towards desired futures. A second key feature turning towards the future of strategic managed retreat might be a much greater diversity of approaches. As we've heard over the last few days, and as all of us work on intensively, retreat to date has been largely a story of buyouts and managed realignment, and a few examples of community relocation. Into the future, there may be a much larger number of ways that retreat occurs, probably, hopefully, not even often feeling like retreat, but something that adds to the degree to which water is managed, for example, the hybrid world here, or that it contributes to greenways and blueways, the living with world, or where it more fundamentally shifts the shape of the landform, consolidated or floating, for example. To get to any of those, it's going to be imperative that we increase pushing towards coordination of priorities, right? Retreat is hard not because of its effectiveness as a risk reduction measure. It is effective if people move to safe places afterwards. It's hard because it affects everything else. And that really is a challenge for adaptation overall, and one that comes into sharp focus for retreat. So how do we get there to this potential future for something more strategic, more managed in a desirable way? We suggest that on the science side, there could be a compelling opportunity to reframe some of the questions we've been asking. So for example, paper after paper, we think hard about where will climate retreat occur, yet this is almost always a view of retreat that is unmanaged forced displacement. Asking where retreat might add up to the priorities that people have is a much harder question, and one that requires bringing together our whole toolkit and being a lot more creative in the space of the adaptation science that we're doing. We also think about the question, is retreat a benefit or a harm? As we've heard over the last 2 days, it's usually assumed that retreat is a harm and a levy is a good. But in fact, under high magnitudes of climate change, whether it's elevation or armoring a coastline or strategic managed retreat, they all have trade-offs. And our real question in practice and research that's supportive of practice is how we can maximize the benefits and reduce and minimize the harms. So talking about retreat is really hard. It puts such a sharp focus on why remaining in place is important to us, what relationships are crucially valued and need to be preserved, and what options do sustainably support individual and community priorities moving forward. And I think this combo of where we might be going and how we get there and what retreat plays in this process or not is really the central challenge before us. Thank you, Brad.
Yes, and thank you, Catherine. Good start. Next in the lineup, I'm going to hand it over to Robin. It's all yours. The stage is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for this opportunity. First, I want to do a land acknowledgement. I work on the lands of the Dena'ina, who have been stewards of these lands for a very, very long time. And I also want to acknowledge my co-author, Patricia Cochran, who is unable to be here this morning. So the focus of our piece was on the critical importance of decolonizing research. And I highly recommend that folks look at the session that happened on Tuesday, where 4 Alaska Native scholars talked about the critical importance of decolonizing research in each of their disciplines. I'm going to focus on, I work as a human rights attorney and also as an interdisciplinary social science scholar. And I want to talk about the critical importance of how research is informing policy in this area and why decolonizing research is so incredibly critical in relationship to the fact that we have absolutely no governance models about how to manage the internal movement of people. And what I mean by that is that what is very clear is that the climate crisis is going to cause millions of people to forced to be moved either on their own or because the government has made the decision, because the places where they live have become uninhabitable. And most countries have zero desire to engage in this space of forcibly relocating people or facilitating a managed movement of people within countries, because most countries in the world who have engaged in this practice have made the decision about when, whether, and where people move, and they have caused horrific consequences to the peoples who have been relocated. In the United States, in Alaska, which is where I do my work, this happened most recently during World War II, where the Unungan people were forcibly relocated by the US government and 10% of the population died. Globally, the World Bank has an involuntary resettlement guidebook that is used by national governments to forcibly relocate people in response to the construction of development projects. And what we know is that in these contexts, people suffer tremendously. They are further impoverished, their cultural and kinship connections are altered. And so research becomes critically important in this space because what we know is we do not know how to manage the internal movement of people, and which is why human rights, as a human rights attorney, human rights has to be the basis of how it is that we look at this issue, of what the values are when we're thinking about what is important in how people move and where they move to. And the right to self-determination is the most important human right to protect. The human right to self-determination means that people get to determine whether, when, and where they move. And it needs to be done in a way where people are engaged prior to that decision needing to be made. So the giant research gaps that exist are what is the connection in ecosystems, specific ecosystems, what will cause people to no longer be able to live in the places they call home because of the combination of slow ongoing environmental change and extreme weather events. And for that reason, one of the part of the work that we are doing is developing community-based environmental monitoring, where Indigenous communities are leading this work and working with other scientists in order to make this very difficult assessment of whether or not they can stay in the place where they are currently living. And looking at US policies, it's clear that these policies are still embedded with colonial and racist structures, and that if we use these policies, they will continue to harm people. So research really needs to be thinking about how to answer these questions and protect the human rights of people as they are no longer able to stay in their homes. Thank you.
And thank you, Robin. Critically important context underlying all that we're talking about and thinking about here today. And hopefully in an effort to sort of to acknowledge and help us move the needle a little bit in a positive direction here, Richard is going to take the baton. Richard, all yours.
Great. Thanks, Brad. And hello to everyone who's joined. Thank you for doing so. I've written a lot of articles, and I just want to say that writing this article was really a humbling and daunting experience. And as a team of co-authors, Pat Reed, Antonia Hadjimichael, and Julie Rosenberg and I spent quite a lot of time, more than I usually get to do, together discussing a set of literatures that we reviewed. And I have to say that it was a little frustrating not to be able to include more of those citations, and because there's a 15 citation limit for policy forum pieces, but that is what it is. Anyway, it's such a fraught topic historically. There's a huge diverse range of literatures that are relevant to it. And in talking to academics who work with people who are in the process of relocating is very different than actually getting to interact with those communities that are going through it. And I have been privileged through Rising Voices, which is an Indigenous science community, as well as a couple of local government coalitions, to get to chat with folks. But again, I approach this with a great deal of humility, simply because I haven't lived the experience that I'm trying to write about. And that's something that I just wanted to acknowledge. So to me, the key takeaways from our article are kind of summarized in the two of the terms in the title: planned relocation, pluralistic and integrated science and governance. And integrated, kind of refers to the fact that any science that intends to directly inform policy and decision-making must be integrated with governance in a very conscious and deliberate fashion. Otherwise, there's a risk that scientists, not with any intention, but unintentionally put our fingers on the scale and favor some groups or outcomes over others. And I'll talk briefly about that. And another key point that comes out of the word integrated is that knowledge about and for relocation isn't going to come from kind of traditional disinterested and separate science. It really needs to be science that's entangled with action and learning and capacity building. And it's going to require skill at engagement and facilitation. It's not a hobby. You really need to be very aware of how as scientists, we approach this integration. Second, the word pluralistic, which to us means a couple of things: embracing a wider range of ways of knowing, and thinking beyond providing just technical inputs, for example, about infrastructure characteristics or hazard likelihoods, but really conducting research on agency and power that different groups have to participate in decision-making and the other processes associated with relocation. And for governance, pluralistic, we mean inclusive, transparent, and accountable processes, as both Catherine and Robin have talked about. that help to establish transition mechanisms that are just and that don't leave intergenerational scars for communities. You know, as we've heard throughout the conference, retreat is a reality. It's triggered by many hazards. It's not just a coastal issue. It's existential, and if it's unmanaged, it can have large unintended consequences and negative consequences for those who stay, for those who leave, and for the communities that receive the migrants. And so the real question that we try to address is how to convert retreat into an option that leaves people in the environment better off. And we were sort of suggested to consider different potential changes in governance, science, and their interactions that could help. And I won't go into the governance suggestions at length. They're the more limited part of the article. You know, I've already emphasized, I think, that that it does require governance that addresses the current mix of policies and institutions and relationships that are producing the current distribution of privilege and vulnerability in society, and that better governance is going to involve ending structural inequalities and perverse incentives and injustices that drive people to settle in areas that are exposed to hazards. And it's also going to require inclusive and deliberative processes that emphasize transparency, engagement, and accountability. There was a great quote from a colleague participating in one of the other sessions that said, "Those moving must control the decision-making," and I think that's exactly right. For science, there's a set of things which we think we can do a better job of, including diversifying framing and ensuring that marginalized communities are incorporated, accounting for power dynamics in the ways that we co-produce knowledge, expanding the use of intermediaries who are trained to be aware of how science and expertise can unintentionally affect power relationships and outcomes, diversifying knowledge sources and types I've already mentioned, reducing our emphasis on trying to predict what will happen and approach uncertainty more as a sampling the future problem, where the question really is how to identify near-term actions with benefits that are robust over the longer term, trying to do social learning to evaluate experience and build local capacity, and then finally harnessing innovations in community science and data analytics more effectively than we're doing. So those were some of the specific suggestions that we think can help retreat become, or managed relocation, whatever you want to call it, and that is indeed an issue to discuss, more effective and to bring about better outcomes for both people and the environment. Thanks.
Many thanks. I appreciate it. You did very good work with that extra minute I gave you there on your presentation. Thanks. Good use of the time. All right.
Thanks.
And next we're going to hand off to Radley. Take it from here. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Brad. Very excited to be on this panel and have the chance to discuss with everyone right now. So our piece was really focused on assessment of habitability thresholds and their links to migration. And we pretty quickly got into this notion of a tension between top-down modeling approaches, often based and very reliant on physical science more than social science, modeling in this top-down context that really relies on universal equations, universal relationships, versus this need that I think we're hearing articulated a lot in the conference for bottom-up approaches, that every place is different, every decision context is different, the background experiences and values of different communities are different. So when we're looking to assess habitability risks and future migration, how do we reach a middle ground that connects these top-down approaches with these more bottom-up, local, social science, humanities-based perspectives? So we started with a focus on physical thresholds, acknowledging that there are some places where sea levels are going to rise so fast, the land is even locally sinking, that we may see permanent inundation, just like there are going to be some places where combinations of heat and humidity, for example, parts of the Persian Gulf, maybe even large populated parts of South Asia, where if you don't have air conditioning, if you're working outdoors for a long period of time, even 6 hours actually, you could really see fundamental physical limits on your ability to survive. So clearly models can play a critical role in helping us understand that. And we talked about a lot of advances that we've seen in that top-down modeling, advances in climate models, building in demographic projections, the world of impacts modeling and assessments like the EasyMIP process that have really helped us understand and see where vulnerabilities are today and how they're going to shift as climate and other variables change in the future. And some of that modeling even can do it sort of like a gravity-based approach, which is essentially not just thinking about stresses towards habitability in particular places, but also where might people be moving to, right? Because it's a dynamic of sort of shifting habitability in different places. But we noted the top-down models are missing a lot of key local context in terms of geophysics, local context in terms of human vulnerabilities and desires and goals, the adaptation landscape, what's feasible and desired to do to adapt to changing climate in different places. And then this really complex notion of the nonlinearities and the tipping points, and especially these social tipping points. At what point does risk perception shift? Do insurance failures occur that might lead to loss of livelihood well in advance of when we actually see the waters leading to permanent inundation or crossing these heat humidity thresholds. So how do you model these complex nonlinearities in the physical system and then especially in the human system? And of course, this does link to the notion of migration in a lot of ways. If some places cross these thresholds, pressures to migrate are going to grow. It may be the only option in some cases, other than becoming trapped for those who are unable to move, especially the most vulnerable communities. But similarly to the notion that there's human capacity to adapt that may allow people to continue to stay in places that are really hot and humid, may even allow us to, in some instances, whether it's through seawalls or more passive environmental approaches, elevating buildings, stay in places even as they permanently inundate. Similarly, when we talk about migration, climate is just going to be one small piece, although of maybe growing importance going forward. So we need to keep that humanity and those human decisions and ingenuity in mind when we're trying to model these things. So wrapping up in terms of our path forward suggestions, we talked about the need for more bottom-up modeling, whether it's ethnographic studies, qualitative information. It takes time. It's costly, but that's the rich source of information that's missing. And how do we come up with organizations, methodologies to meet that top down and bottom up? In my opinion, no one has that really nailed quite yet, but I'd love to hear from panelists on what they think that middle space looks like. We need more qualitative approaches, things like storylines that acknowledge deep uncertainty and engage stakeholders from the beginning in designing these futures that they want to see. We talked about the need for an intercomparison project focused on habitability so that we can test different models. We called out and urged desire for an IPCC special report on migration issues. And just to wrap up, clearly there are some deep uncertainties that we highlighted in the article, but there's also a lot that we know. We know that for some places, people are going to be able to stay longer, if you will, even as these physical thresholds are crossed. In other places, societal tipping points are going to mean that for some vulnerable groups, the tip may happen before the really extreme climate events occur. Think of economic spirals, for example, if tax revenues and property values are to drop. And the one thing that we really know for sure, sadly, is that it's going to be the most vulnerable communities, those that have experienced a lot of injustice in the past, those that have not been responsible for a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions and development practices that have gotten us into this problem, that are likely to be the most vulnerable. So the fundamental need is to come up with ways to address those issues with a human-centric approach that starts with communities, not with top-down climate science or physical modeling. Okay, thanks, Brad.
And thank you, Radley. Next, if you're like me and you see all this information and you're wondering, how do we extract some sort of order and steps forward out of this chaos? Well, thankfully, Marjolein has plenty to say about that. She's going to tell us about how to distill this information and, you know, try and map some concrete steps forward. So Marjolein, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Brad. So me and my co-authors, Judy Lawrence and Alex Magno, we have written about pathways to retreat. And we argue actually that the shrinking solution space that we see as sea levels continue to rise calls for a dynamic adaptive planning now. And I'd like to share the figure, one of the figures that we have. Let me see if that succeeds. I think you can see my screen now. And in this figure, we show that as sea levels rise, the the narrowing of the solution space with the different options of protect, accommodate, and retreat. And you also see differences in the ratio between the different strategies of protect, accommodate, and retreat. And this is general, but yeah, there's a difference across different archetypes. So given that this shrinking solution space is happening, the other reason why we need to think about this dynamic adaptive planning now is that there is a legacy of many decisions that we take now. And this creates path dependencies that can also result in maladaptation. So it's important to consider now already the long-term adaptation needs and what could be sustainable and low regret action for the near term. So what the paper is about is how we can explore alternative pathways, including retreat. So we try to visualize that in this figure where you see an overall adaptation pathways map in the upper part, with different adaptation strategies that Catherine also mentioned, like the advance, protect, accommodate, and then of course also retreat. And different strategies also have their limits. So they are, or thresholds, like Radley explained. Protect cannot be affordable or even an effective solutions in all regions. It's quite costly and can be affordable for resource-rich megacities, but yeah, there's also limits with, for example, groundwater, river flows. So it's not a positive outcome in all situations. It also shows that at some point maybe retreat is inevitable. So then the lower part shows a bit in more detail different pathways to retreat. It shows that retreats can exist in general in 3 stages: from prepare, active retreat, and cleanup. And there's 2 lines at the bottom, the gray lines, that show that the engagement with communities, I think it's mentioned already several times during the conference, needs to start early. Monitoring is very important to show when to start part of the actions. And then it starts with the design of the plan, of course, with engagement of the communities. And different steps that include this pathway to retreat are enabling the investments and regulations, land right negotiations and the property acquisitions, and then potentially a buyout, relocation of public infrastructure, and development of alternative land, and then a set of cleanup measures that we kind of tend to forget. So what we use is the dynamic adaptive policy pathways approach to identify different sequences of actions. And this can also help to illuminate where and how retreat can have positive outcome and avoid investments that we later regret. So increasing the sunk cost actually. Yeah, some of the building blocks of pathways to retreat exist of this early engagement with communities, but also avoiding developments in places that are very risky. I think avoidance of developments is unappreciated strategy actually. We could do more of that. And in a third lesson that I think is also important is considering whether buying time through temporary measures like accommodate or protect or nature-based solutions will trigger greater risk exposure in the end. So is it useful to do that now and then start the process of retreat, or does it attract more developments in the areas that are protected as such? So in a way, I think, yeah, there's this link with the exploring the full solution space and including retreat as part of options. And then you can evaluate the trade-offs of alternative pathways and decide what could be low regret actions for the near term. I give it back to you, Brett.
Okay. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Next up is going to be Bina, and she's going to discuss the issue that, there's the adage, what gets measured gets managed. And so what doesn't get measured maybe doesn't get managed too well. And in the case of retreat, we know that there are costs, immense costs potentially, and these could be useful for informing debate and planning and decision-making, but maybe we don't really have a good grip on what those costs are. And so Bina's going to tell us about some leading efforts to try and wrap some numbers on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brad. And indeed, what we're trying to do with our piece is really to put forward first the proposition that we need to understand better the costs associated with displacement in the context of climate change, and really to make the case for the more prospective action that Catherine and a lot of you already and others at the conference have talked about, really to move from response to a forward-looking proactive approach. And for this, we cover three main points, in a sense, in the paper, building on different types of collaboration we've had from IDMC, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, with experts on different topics, including the Potsdam Climate Institute, as well as IIASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, and ETH Zurich. And what we try to do is really to look a little bit at what we know currently about the scale of forced displacement in this context, and what we know about the associated costs. Then look at future risks, because we all know, and as we've seen in a number of contributions here, that the past is in a sense not a good indication for what awaits us in the future. And then to look at what the implications are if we put the what we know now on the cost and the risk projections together, what the implications are for financing and for really meeting the costs. And currently, and this is what we've seen again and again, the costs are already been borne by the communities that Robin was talking about, others have been presenting on over the past 2 days. They're borne by the communities, local governments often, but also national governments, and they're not on anybody's balance sheet right now. And they're not really planned into longer term strategies, and that makes response, but also in particular preventive action, ineffective and often just not available. So for those three areas, some of the, maybe just to give you a few top line insights on some of the numbers that we're trying to put to it, we report at IDMC every year more than 24 million displacements in the context of disasters, of which the majority, so for 2020, for example, it's been more than 30 million, and the vast majority was in the context of weather-related disasters, which are not all directly, as we know, linked to climate change, but increasingly the likelihood of them occurring can be traced and linked to climate change on many occasions. And the dollars attached, in a sense, to the direct economic costs, and this is really just the immediate economic costs we've been looking at for starters, is immense. And we've learned from conflict contexts where we've costed it out, and it amounts to more than $20 billion, just meeting the immediate needs of people displaced in conflict. Gives us an idea of what we're looking at in the context of disaster. But there are huge data and information gaps when it comes to understanding what happens to people who have been displaced during extreme events, but particularly also in slow onset event context, as we know. And in particular, further down the line, so once an event has happened, what happens to them a few months or years after? And this has implications, again, as we said, for, as I said earlier, for these costs being therefore then hidden. And we also show that it's not So both the current scale, but also future risks is a global phenomenon truly, but it's also highly concentrated in certain areas. But the cost should, because it's global and also affects high-income countries, we give an example from the Australian bushfires, it's really something that all countries should invest in. In terms of the global risk and understanding the scale of future displacement in this regard, what we also try to bring forward, and this is something that ETH Zurich and PIC have been working on a lot, is to look at the role of climate change in relation also to other factors in increasing the displacement risk. So what we've what we put forward is that there's a 50% increase in displacement risk associated with every degree of temperature increase. But we also see, so that is significant, of course, but we also see that demographic change and population growth has a huge impact. And we all know that inequality, and some of you have highlighted the fact that it's the most vulnerable who are going to be on the move and forced to flee. And inequality is a massive driver. And we also find that even with our models and with what's out there right now, it's still too focused on the hazard and on the climatic factors, as well as on physical exposure indeed, rather than on vulnerabilities. So the third area in terms of the financing that we put forward is really to show that this has, as I said, a direct impact, not just on communities though, but also on national budgets and the availability also of not just humanitarian response funds, but also development funds, because it's really often, of course, as we know, occurs in areas with already extremely stretched capacities. And an example of Bangladesh that the work that we've done with YASA shows us and highlights, shows that for events with the likelihood of happening every 10 years, Bangladesh, with its access to its own development funds, humanitarian funds as well, would not be able to cover the costs associated with displacement alone, not on top of the other associated costs with the disaster event. So just to wrap up, I think, some of what we put forward is just to show that risk science itself is still a really recent and new science, but it can be applied successfully. It's a huge opportunity to apply now to the topic of displacement, if done in a way that is open source, because a lot of the models are really from, have been developed originally by the industry, insurance industry, and have been a black box. They have to really be owned by countries, and increasingly also, as we heard earlier, by communities. So I'd really like to discuss in the next portion to see, what do we really mean by pluralistic methods? We use the term as well in our paper, and how do we actually kind of bring together these different types of approaches and inform the models that we have and that we can bring down to a very granular local level, but with these community perspectives. I'll stop there, and thank you very much, Brad.
Thank you, Bina. Up until now, we've been discussing these issues in sort of a broader global context, not really focusing on one particular place, but we decided it would be very useful for the collection of articles here to focus on kind of a case study. And for that case study, we thought that there's a lot to be learned from Bangladesh, in particular because it's high population density. And so if we're talking about needing to retreat and move someplace, well, there's maybe not a lot of places that aren't already inhabited. So how do you manage these issues when there's not necessarily as much freedom to move? And so Mizan and his colleagues have been working intently on that issue for quite a while. And so they shared in the magazine, and he's going to share with us today some lessons. Thank you.
So thank you, Brad. You already have given the introduction of the compulsion of our first model of establishing kind of migrant-friendly towns. And our second model that we proposed is selective relocation abroad. The reason you know about the first model, I don't need to explain the vulnerability of South Asia or Bangladesh. Bangladesh is regarded as a leader in economic growth, adaptation, and disaster management globally. But can you imagine that exactly half of the US population, 165 million, live in a space 1.5% of the size of the US land. So obviously we don't have any space for retreat. That is the reason our main option is kind of transforming our smaller towns to shift the inflow of climate refugees away from larger cities like Dhaka to smaller circular towns where investments are happening, particularly in elevated river ports and coastal areas, because economic activities are there much more than the inland cities. Our institution, International Center for Climate Change and Development, we have been working for the last almost 3 years, but that is still at the beginning stage because this is a very gigantic task, where we try to integrate 3 aspects of this model, what we call hardware, software, which includes policies and all those hardwares, infrastructures, buildings, housing, and what I call we have expressed the expression hardware about the ethics and values of living together, community cohesion. In Bangladesh, we have community cohesion because we have almost only 98-99% of ethnic Bengalis. So in that respect, we don't have much conflicts, but there are resource conflicts, because huge scarcity. So this is just the beginning. And our second model that we have proposed is selective relocation abroad, because you cannot rule out the possibility of cross-border human mobility during disasters or after or before disaster. This is happening and this will happen. And then we were thinking that under paragraph 14F of the Cancun Agreement, which was adopted about 10 years back, gives us a good space for thinking through, because that 3-line para 14F contains 3 types of actions, 3 types of ideas. One is skills of mobility, national, regional, international, then types of mobility, displacement, migration, and planned relocation, and 3 types of actions like research, cooperation, and coordination. But we are retreating back. I myself am a long-time climate negotiator with the Bangladesh government for the last 20 years and closely follow the loss and damage negotiations, where climate displacement is one subject, but very, very disputed, not very liked, We have international initiatives, but not much progress. We have Nansen Initiative, we have the GCM, we have the task force under the WIM, but not much progress because multilateral processes are extremely painstakingly slow. So what we are thinking is, if bilateral deals can happen between the demographically deficit developed countries, they need a skilled young labor force because of aging cohorts and demographic deficit. And these displacement hotspot countries have enough surplus labor. So there can be bilateral deals, precedents of which we already have in many different ways. So these countries bilaterally can get into deals, and based on the projected demands of developed countries, they can get these displaced people can get training in jointly supported educational and training institutions. And over 5 or 10 years, for example, they can be prepared for moving to some developed country, either on temporary circular process or for permanent relocation. This depends on the agreement. But there are great challenges, There is xenophobia, anti-immigration sentiments. There are resource scarcity, capability scarcity, lack of coordination, all those. So but economically, the selective relocation, economic migration, in fact, are all positive for economic growth and revenue generation. I found no literature depicting a negative picture on that. And for the sending countries also, this is absolutely positive for achieving the SDGs, for their economic growth, for the education of the children. So if selective relocation happens, the able-bodied members of the displaced families, for example, they can move to, with proper education and training, move to those countries and send back the remittance. And even in 2017, we have cited that almost $500 billion there's income from the foreign labors. So this is much more, 3 times more than the ODA. So this is a mutually beneficial option, win-win options. But the challenge is that developed countries have this kind of still look at global cooperation as a zero-sum game through the lens of Westphalian model of sovereignty and national interest. What we really need is kind of a positive sum approach to global cooperation based on a smarter pooled sovereignty. What all the major experts, social science experts, I can cite by names, but not enough time, that they advocate for looking at the global cooperation with a positive sum approach. So this was what we wanted to share. I think if we need much more research on this, as several speakers have mentioned, we need to have more research because this is a new area with not much past experience at all, and we need more science policy interface. So thank you very much.
And thank you. And last but certainly not least, Jola is going to draw our attention to the critical importance of including justice as a key metric of success and progress in these retreat efforts, and she'll remind us and document what happens when we don't. So Jola, thank you.
Thank you so much, Brad, and thank you everyone for being here today. It's really an honor to share this platform with everyone who wrote in the Science Journal. My contribution was largely a blog that is really meant to help us think about a range of things around the spectrum of risks and challenges, excuse me, that people face. Whether we do retreat or whether people migrate, one of the key things that I know, and I think many people have talked about here throughout this conference, is the issue of the challenges are multiple. They're just a lot. There are people who, when they want to retreat, they don't have the option to do so. They feel trapped in place. They feel invincible. They feel forgotten. We need to think about those people. What are the policies and plans that are available to address those challenges? Whether people retreat, what happens in the new places where they go? What are the new hazards they face there? How are we thinking of mitigating those new hazards? Because as you know, climate change is not something we can retreat from. It's here, we have to deal with it. And there are hazards even in those new places. And there are instances where people move to another area where they face livelihood challenges, which then makes them go back to the old places where they vacated. And similarly, when you look at the migration side of things, there are all these challenges people face with physical livelihood constraints as well. There are people who feel trapped in transit trying to get to Europe or trying to get to America. And even sometimes relocating between rural area and urban areas within Africa or within Asia or even within Latin America, where people move and then they feel trapped in slums. Those are different experiences, some of them triggered by climate change, but others triggered by a range of other social inequities and structural challenges that has been in the system. And there is also situations where people moved into refugee camps and they face all types of challenges. And even those refugee camps themselves are exposed to the elements. And so based on a lot of the presentations we've heard, we know for sure that we need to center equity, and we also know that historical, economic, environmental, and developmental factors intersect to induce displacement and to induce migration for people, to induce retreat as well. And we also know that climate change impact is a symptom of all of those historical challenges and structural challenges, and it's an exacerbator of risks. We know that. And again, we're seeing in some cases where climate adaptation practices, whether it's migration, retreat, or other types of practices, including structural measures, are also allowing for the reproduction of inequality. and reproduction of injustices. The question becomes, how do we address this? What are the policies, what are the science that helps us to deal with these types of issues? And so for more of my work and some of the things that I wrote in the science journal is really to center attention on the different and varieties of experiences and challenges that different groups face locally and internationally. I want to quickly remind us of communities here. This is a community in India who for some years their island has been shrinking, and they experience this lack of visibility because they do want to move, because they've reached this social limit of adaptation, but there hasn't been any support for them to move. And so that's one example, but other examples that I'll be talking about during my keynote today where people actually move or face new challenges. And there is the experience of migrants, right? My colleague was just talking earlier about Bangladesh and some of the work that is going on there. We also know that when the Rohingya refugee fled Bangladesh, over 700,000 people fled in 2017, they ended up in Cox's Bazar refugee camps. And when they were there, the refugee camps themselves, let me go here. The camps themselves are exposed to the elements exposed to climate change impact, and the camps was not necessarily the best place for people to live, but that was the only place they could go because they were facing ethnic cleansing in their own country, which was caused by the military crackdown. And then the Bangladeshi government decided, oh, this situation in this camp is not tenable. They needed to address it. And then they moved people to this area. The 10,000 people have been moved here, according to several media reports. On the face value, this looks like a decent place to move. But when you look at where this place is located around this floating area, if you look at it, you can see that this location itself is also very dangerous, even though it feels like they're moving people from a refugee camp, but then you move people to another area that is also likely to be exposed to sea level rise. And there are papers and reports that suggest by in 30 years, this island itself might disappear. And there has been a lot of resistance. And we know that the Rohingya people have been marginalized multiple ways in their own country and also within Bangladesh. There is this challenge that they face because they're not necessarily part of the Bangladeshi cohesive ethnic group. And so what happens where people are moved into areas that are likely to be exposed to sea level rise and flooding now and even into the future? One of the key things people talk about when they're thinking about retreat is moving people to a higher ground. That has always been the conversation. Okay, you have to move people from lower ground to higher ground to protect them. But what happens when the people who are already vulnerable because of their ethnicity, because of the challenges in their country, because of political issues, and because of the refugee status, they are then moved to a lower ground, which seemed like it was well built, but then the exposure and the social isolation they are likely to face by moving to this area or by being asked and forced to move to this area. And so this is what it looks like, the refugee camp, this is what it looks like. And there has been a lot of human rights scholars and activists and writers really trying to call attention to what is going on in the context of this group, particularly the vulnerability that this refugee community faces. So for me, and during my talk this afternoon, I'm hoping to address some of the things, some of these challenges and others. But the question I want to leave us with right now is, what are the policies and laws that are necessary to address these types of processes and injustices where migration and relocation intersect? We've seen instances, I mean, from the earlier picture I showed you a picture where people are just retreating or relocating. That's one thing. There are people who are migrating, but there are also people like the Rohingya refugee who are in the center of this issue, where they are both migrants and they're both relocatees. Relocatees in the sense that they are now being moved to an area that is exposed and will be exposed in the future as well to flooding and to sea level rise. And so my question is, who has the responsibility? How do we center equity locally and internationally in addressing the challenges of people migrating and relocating? Where does the responsibility lie? Is it with the local government? Is it with the Bangladeshi government? Is it with the international organizations? Is it with different UN organizations? Who is supposed to be dealing with these types of issues? And what policies do we have to address all of the multiple variants of challenges that we're seeing induced by climate change, but also induced by policies that are meant to allow people to reduce risks or to address climate change adaptation challenges? So I'll leave it there, but I hope to really explore and really just showcase some of the findings from other work that we've been doing. I'll be speaking to that during my keynote this afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you. And again, thank you all. I'll say, having read seemingly dozens of versions of all of these presentations over the past few months as we've iterated toward the final magazine, everyone who just spoke has done an excellent job of synthesizing some of the key messages in their pieces. That said, there's tremendous richness in the written pieces themselves. And so I encourage you to all in the audience to go consult the magazine. And if you are interested, it is sciencemag.org. And yeah, it's an ORG because we are a nonprofit, scientific society publishing organization. So you go to sciencemag.org, and if you look for the issue of 18th of June, 2021, you'll see all of these things in all their splendor. So now we're going to have a little bit of discussion amongst the panelists, and then I see some great questions coming up from the audience, and we'll get to those shortly as well. I guess the first question, I want to take the prerogative here. A lot of what a theme that emerges in across all of your presentations and frankly across the entire conference is that, research can do more, research could be done differently. Whether we're talking about, integrating of top-down and bottom-up technical methods, where we're talking about needing to give voices and power to different communities in the research process, or anything in between. But that's all well and good, but research doesn't just happen by chance. Part of it's driven by the researcher's curiosity and their view of problems and how they want to solve problems. But there's also an immense incentive structure out there. A lot of the researchers in this space are academics, and no matter what they want to research, tenure and promotion committees and policies influence how they conduct their business, and grant funding and journal policies can influence how research is done. And similar in other sectors, there's a whole number of issues that influence how research is done and what gets researched. And so, whether we're talking about private sector, public sector, NGOs, academics. And so I would just like to throw it out there. That's sort of a big softball question. Is it simply that we need more awareness of implications and issues, or is it just a matter of money and capacity building, or some wholesale restructuring of how academic research is incentivized? Who wants to dive in here and pile on?
I'll just get us started. Really want to hear from others. Yeah, I think within speaking as an academic, the incentive structures I think really do need to shift. How do we encourage this kind of interdisciplinarity? It's talked about a lot, but really I think it's only through conferences like this and engagements sort of outside of our comfort zones, whether it's with fellow academics, whether it's with communities. I feel like that's the only way we really have a hope of sort of learning emotionally why this issue is so important, but also understanding the limitations of our own discipline. I mean, as a climate scientist, I see so many well-meaning climate scientists who still really think that it's an issue of not enough information, that if their climate research was better understood, it would in itself enable better decisions. So that's just one little microcosm. How do we reward the difficult interdisciplinarity? How do we reward the process of taking the time to just learn from others, the process of trust building and working with communities? I think that's one dimension. And you alluded to the role of the private sector. That's another interesting component. If the universities can be honest brokers, what role do we have in helping to encourage these kind of discussions in real and nuanced ways?
Maybe just one brief addition. A lot of us in this room and far beyond have been hard at work at what we've been calling the science of actionable knowledge, and essentially recognizing that you can look back decades for the history of action research, which we've been hearing about at this conference, or community-based research. And a lot of that's really coming together in the space of adaptation science. And as Radley described, usually there is a lot more interaction between any academic researcher and a practitioner or a policymaker in this type of work. And a lot of the advance in this space has been emphasizing the degree to which there is a huge diversity of ways that researchers and practitioners interact, and calling it all co-production and thinking it's one same thing is really simplifying it in ways that can be problematic. And second, when scientists jump into practice, it is inherently political, and there's a huge need for evaluation to make sure that academics saying that, we're not political, science is neutral, well, that doesn't actually hold out in practice. And really only by understanding the experience from all perspectives can we hope that science productively adds to the ongoing challenges and ways societies are grappling with them.
And if I could just add, in the piece that we wrote, we referenced a letter that was written by 4 Alaska Native organizations to the National Science Foundation. So several years ago, the National Science Foundation began a new program, Navigating the New Arctic, which was to look at the climate crisis in the Arctic in a variety of disciplines. And these 4 Alaska Native organizations wrote this letter to the National Science Foundation because as Indigenous peoples of the Arctic, they were not involved in many of the proposals that were eventually funded, or they were asked by the scientists who were submitting proposals to get the buy-in at the end when the proposals were already written and they wanted an Indigenous organization to then affirm their proposal after the questions had already been decided. And so it's critically important. The National Science Foundation, we've made suggestions about how their funding can be more accessible to communities on the ground who need to be guiding the questions and methodologies of science and really focusing on the co-production of knowledge. Because most of the speakers today, this morning, have focused on the importance of the communities on the ground facing this issue, that they need to be involved in these research questions. And it's critically important that those communities get access to the funding. So they're inviting us to the table, not we inviting them to the table after we've determined what questions we want to be asked and answered.
Anyone else have?
If I may come in.
Of course.
Brad, if I may come in for a minute.
Yes, of course.
As a Southern voice. Yes, as I ended up with my intervention with the need for research. But research, this is a new area, climate-induced displacement, but development agencies or developed countries don't fund research much, particularly in the southern countries. We need money, for example, adaptation finance. I'm a negotiator on climate finance. Adaptation money is adaptation money more, but also research-based, and we need policy-based action research. You are familiar with there is a new alliance now, Action Research ARA, where our center is a very active member. And Bradley has mentioned about universities. University can be really the central hub of doing this kind of research, because we have graduate students who always go to the field for doing experiential learning-based research. So I think we need much more support internationally for doing research. Thank you very much of this kind.
Sure. I'd really like to give everyone an opportunity to answer this question. So is there anyone, is anyone, yes.
Yeah, Brad, Brad.
Okay, I want to go to Bina first.
Sorry, Richard. Yeah, no, very briefly, just because I agree with what has been said, but because we operate a lot, in a sense, at the interface of science and policy, because we ourselves are not an academic institution. What we grapple with and where we really see a problem is also the tendency to put out big numbers, right? So we also put out numbers, but we try to be as solid, but also conservative as possible with the modeling, with any data that we put out. And yet, that's what's being picked up. We want to bring in nuance. We want to discuss the complexity of the issue, and then it's getting, that gets lost in translation. And I think we need to keep plugging away at that much more and really take on the responsibility of not allowing for even our own comms teams, but also our interfaces and our counterparts in policy making to take these shortcuts. Yet at the same time, having said that, we also have to challenge ourselves, I think, as those at the interface, but also as researchers, to really change a little bit the packaging. And I think you've done a great job, Brad, in this science issue to bring together, a different set of contributions that are, though, very, in a sense, that make it very visible what we're talking about and very clear and tangible, even though it's very complex issues and concepts that we're talking about. and having more, visual ways and packaged ways in this sense of then and short and sweet. Catherine, the visual that you presented, I think a lot that's going to be used a lot, and many other ways of just really pushing that over to those that are we want them to use our information, and it's currently often not possible. Thanks.
Okay, Richard, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of wisdom already. I think that the things that I see are bringing about structural changes at different points in the academy and in our funding structures. So, for example, tenure decisions really need to reflect and reward people who are involved in this kind of work, and not just from the point of view of how many publications do they get in science and nature, but also trying to develop better ways of measuring impact, broadly within communities. And that, is something that academic institutions aren't really very good at yet. Another one, I think, for funders across the spectrum is to include, research budgets just get whittled down to the bare minimum all the time. And when you try to include people who are able to do this kind of work with communities in your research budget, it's very, as several have said, it's time consuming, requires a lot of expertise, it's expensive. It always gets whittled down compared to the other kinds of expenditures in research. And so I think that's another way that we could really see starting to shift some of the incentives. And there are movements in this direction, but I don't think we've gotten as far as we need to yet.
Marjolein, anything to add on this?
Well, I recognize a lot what you've been saying. I'm working also at a knowledge institute, which is on the edge of like university and more like advisory work for the government. So on the one hand, it's do we want to look? We need to make proposals, and then looking at retreat is not something that is really attractive from also from a decision maker point of view. Even if you want to show that it could be in the end a positive outcome, so that's a challenge. And then I also recognize that if you want to spend a lot of time with communities, then that is not always appreciated from an academic point of view. So you're kind of stuck in between. But in the end, we also have some successful studies and also in practice some relocation that was done in a participatory process with the government.
Great. And I believe, Jola, I think everyone else has mentioned that you would love to hear any thoughts you might have here as well. And then we'll move on.
Thank you, Brad. I think everyone has really mentioned a lot of things that I consider to be very important, whether it's the reward system in academia, which oftentimes we're all chasing papers, we're chasing the high quality journals, and then you don't have that time to invest in communities like people have mentioned. And that for me is also an equity issue, right? It's an equity issue in terms of how do you manage your own individual time in trying to meet the requirement of the institution, but also in trying to do what you believe instinctively can actually advance change in the society. There's always that struggle that most of us who are in academia face. How do we overcome that, especially even if you're a younger or a junior scholar trying to do this work in both spaces? So that's a challenge. But it's also the challenge where we as academics, we need to be humble enough to learn from communities, to listen to them, to really understand what it is that they are facing. And that's what I hope to talk about this afternoon, where we don't go in with our own knowledge from just this four-walled space, where we're there to just understand what are the challenges they are facing and how can we elevate their voice. And that's what I tell people when journalists reach out to me. I'm saying, I don't have an agenda. My agenda in other senses, how can I elevate the voices of people that I work with? It's not so much about me. I have a good house somewhere, I have a job somewhere, but there are all these other people out there facing real challenges, and we are writing about them. In some cases, even making a career based on their own lives. How do we switch that around where our careers actually help to elevate and advance people's lives? How do our science help to elevate and advance people's lives and change society? And I don't think we're there yet. And we need to begin to think about structures in society that can help us to change what we have right now and move towards a system that allows for improvement of people's personal goals, but also of the community livelihoods and improvement in every other thing that they want to do.
Great. Thank you. Before we move on, I would just like to say, a number of you touched on the importance of funding to help do this very costly but important work. For those of you in the US or who follow the US, you may have known that a few weeks ago, President Biden proposed a massive increase in funding focused on climate change. And that's just across the board. And so now everyone is clamoring to get a piece of that pie. And so there's a chance that maybe they'll get it right, and there's a chance that maybe they won't. And so, if you care deeply about this, now's the time, as Congress is still trying to hash out the details and sign the checks, now would be the time to, call your congressional representative and let them know how you think that money should be spent. And tell them Science Magazine censored. It's okay. So, but we're not a political organization. Okay. Let me see. Another question I had personally, and then I'll back off, is just, we were happy as Science Magazine to play a role, as a convener, trying to elevate voices, to help you elevate the voices of the communities. But we know we can always do things better and do things differently. And I think, we've seen a lot of coverage of this topic, in mass media over the past few years, and certainly scientific journals. But, and Bina, you mentioned how, we need to resist, oversimplifying things and just focusing on one big number. But, have you, in your experience with journals and journalists in the media, have you taken any lessons in terms of like, wow, we're really missing this opportunity? Or is there some great untapped potential here that, as far as communicating the importance of these issues and then leading to greater impact?
Do you want me to come in on this?
Well, yeah, if there's anyone, I just didn't know. And, if this is sort of like a dumb question, that we can discuss offline, but I was just wondering if anyone had any particular, takeaways as like, well, here's the thing that seems to be completely missed by the public, and it's in part due to a lack of, effective communication. Does that make any sense?
So if I may step in.
Yeah, please.
I live in Alaska. I've lived here for a very long time, and the climate crisis, as you all know, is happening twice as fast in the Arctic. And the reason why I mention that is because the issue of the relocations happening in Alaska has been in the media for at least 20 years. And, when I started this work now 16 years ago, I was mostly working on the international level, and people at the international level were telling me that I was talking science fiction about the fact that relocations were going to be of this century, not end of century or next century. And I mention that because there has been so much media attention on what is happening in Alaska, and yet there is so little movement in regard to this issue that several of us have talked about the policies that need to be created in this space where we do not have policies to address the issue. And I'm not sure, honestly, like I think the Science Magazine, the current journal, is a really important contribution. And I think one of the reasons why people focus on these numbers and looking at the crisis upon us is to get national governments to step into that space. And I see that there have been a number of questions about how to get national governments to step into this space. And I think it's really hard because of what we've all talked about. It's really complicated. We have a horrific legacy of doing this, and research is critically important to moving this forward in a really careful way, but it's urgent. It is so urgent that we create a governance framework based on community-based research to answer these questions. And I hope this publication moves national governments forward in taking on the issue. And of course, having communities lead the conversation. But that's my concern. There's been so much media attention, and in the US, even with Obama coming to the Arctic, right? Very little was done after he came and left.
Thank you.
Brad, I
Oh,
just
okay.
wanted to reinforce one thing that Robin just said, which is the importance of having communities lead these conversations and how difficult when you're talking about national governments that is to make happen. And even in fairly, in areas where it should be easier, things like climate information services and so forth, it usually ends up being about what federal agencies can provide. There's a kind of a push from the top down. And it's, in some cases, even legal restrictions that the agencies feel prohibit them from having sustained dialogue with communities that would enable them to understand better what's needed and bring forth the voices of communities. So it's just not a, we have to keep working at it, but it isn't something I think that the agencies themselves are going to be able to do on their own. We're going to need Congress in this country to step in and create a new structure that requires that these voices be included from the bottom.
Great. So yes, this is great to hear, and this is setting us up for us now to jump to some of the questions that have come from the audience. So we're talking the talk, but now how do we get governments to walk the walk? And so I know that a number of you have actual concrete experience in working with governments, and so I would love to hear any lessons you have on this. The question from the audience is, how do we better incorporate national governments into these conversations? Or to what extent do you believe this is possible? So Bina, how about you take that? And then I'm sure a number of the others of you have also dealt with government for better or worse. And so we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much. And I think what Robin and Richard just referred to there is a great starting point. And you're a challenge for us to think about this as an opportunity right now of what's happening in the US. I think what's really, and it relates to missed opportunities, we're often missing the opportunity to really look towards the so-called, what we would like to call champion countries. And they're often very small, or champion communities, and to really position it in a sense that, we talked about the decolonization of science that's needed. It's the same in the policy space and in the international arenas and conversations that are often being convened, by representatives of either UN agencies or countries of the so-called global north and of so-called donor countries. And I mean, we're in, for example, we also receive funding from countries that themselves experience disaster displacement, and though do not want to, in a sense, be included in that whole analysis that we put forward. We put forward the numbers, but when it comes to really highlighting the issues of inequality and vulnerability that drive displacement in these contexts, and we'd rather, or they'd rather have us look at other countries. And that is, I think, a key issue that we can all collectively work on. And I would hope that not just the science but issue, but maybe really an IPCC special report that highlights really what's going on in the high income countries, and that they can learn from countries, for example, like small island states. Fiji has planned relocation guidelines that they've consulted on with communities. There are numerous other examples. Is the US willing to learn from countries like that?
Oh, Mizan, I know that you've worked a lot with local communities and national governments. I'd love to hear your thoughts here.
Yes, thank you, Brad. Yes, you all know that based on our experiential learning for ages, we have learned to live with disasters. And that is what made us more resilient. And Dhaka is regarded as kind of an adaptation capital, or lessons to learn from. Obviously, Bangladesh government is very sensitive. There is no doubt about it. Bangladesh government totally owns this process of disaster management, and we have an internal displacement policy adopted in 2015, where we have a displacement management framework with 3 phases: pre-disaster, during disaster, and post-disaster. And the selective relocation, for example, is the idea contained in that strategy that we have, that able-bodied members of the displaced families, if they can move to developed countries on even temporary rotation basis, like Spain and Colombia have got the agreement, then the remittance can support, for example, the left back members of those families. So our government is very much into it, very much. It's a leader kind of in the developing world to mainstream this kind of issues. I thank Zola for bringing out the issue of Rohingya refugees. Our government, for example, is doing much more that it has the capability of doing so. Now, there is not much research I find across the world that who is responsible. She raised the issue as a young research activist. Whose responsibility is it? It is mainly the responsibility of the regional countries and the global countries, global communities. But not much research is there. Why this solution? There is not much solution about this. More than 1 million refugees are cramped in such a small place, and that Cox's Bazar area was a pristine land from the environmental point of view, but it has been totally reshaped, totally has been raped, all those environmental ills with this. So we need, more global responsibility, not only just national governments, like for example, India and China, our immediate neighbors. They are not speaking out to solve this problem, this major regional power. Then in the Security Council, there is no kind of positive voting, always veto by these or that member of the permanent Security Council permanent members. So this is just a tragedy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question from the audience. We're not going to be able to get to all these. Thank you so much. But several of the speakers today have explicitly mentioned it, but also underlined. I think it's kind of underlined everyone's discussion is, the importance of human rights and justice concerns.
Yes.
And the question is, I do not know the UN Declaration of Human Rights well, but the question is, should that declaration be updated to include a clear statement on climate and environmental justice concerns?
Yes.
Hi, Brad.
Oh, yes. Okay, Jola.
I actually want to speak to the previous comments.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, sorry.
I was just waiting for you to say, go ahead.
Oh,
and so I want to build on what Beanie and Dr. Yeah, I think it's Dr. My colleague from Bangladesh. Yes, Dr. Khan. That he said. What I was thinking about when he spoke was really, when they both spoke, was really the issue of valuation, right? As humanity, what we value tend to reflect in what we do. If you think about what's happening between countries, particularly between the US and China, for instance, there is this rate and investment in trying to, who is going to create the best AI, who is going to create the best, the next 5G, 6G, whatever technology to solve whatever they think they want to solve economically. But I don't see people thinking who is going to create the best or the most robust justice systems. I don't mean national, I don't mean justice system in terms of legal system. I mean in terms of climate change justice approaches. Who is going to create the most viable solutions to climate change? I don't see people rushing and trying to address those issues in a competitive way. But you see people doing that when it comes to economic issues. And so that speaks to me in terms of our valuation system, still very much rooted not only in capitalism, but in this competition about economics, about who is the best. What about who can be the best in solving the global challenges that we face? And so when we're thinking about what needs to change, we also need to think about how do our valuation as humans and as individuals, but also as communities and countries, how does our valuation system needs to change so we can move forward? It is not only about changing the technology or changing or moving people from point A to B. It's really about what do we value as a people and how can that reflect in the things that we do and in the structures and systems that we build going forward, including what I believe the next question is about. We need to change and recreate the UN declaration to be more robust, to reflect the new values that we want to really see today. Are there existing values that we like from there that we can carry forward? Are there new values that we need to incorporate so that we can all collectively address climate change as a humanity? And that's what I think is a big issue we haven't really spoken about much right now, but we need to think about changing our value systems as well.
Thank you so much for that. Let me look back here, a few other questions. So I guess I work at a lot of these issues are profound and touch society in many ways, but as where I sit as a scientific magazine editor, and we want to focus on what role can research play in this. A lot of these things are so beyond and more than just research. But the question is, massive retreat is rapidly becoming a massive scientific research question, and questions of this size in the past have contributed to the development of new science. And let's apply that lens here. How is it this massive all hands on deck approach is just potentially can change how science is fundamentally done, and that could have ripple effects across other disciplines and other topics. And I think we see a lot of that emerging here. But anyone want to, where do you see opportunities and a lot of promise for just changing fundamentally the scientific enterprise?
I can jump in here. I think that what science can do is integrate knowledge from different countries. Just what we talked about is what if we can learn from the different experiences and how we can have retreat have more positive outcome. I think that could be a role for science. How can it be done in such a way? How can we prepare for the long term and not only like I think at least with the pathways approach, what I see helps in practice if we can make a big thing, a big decision, if we can kind of unravel it in smaller steps and show how that can be done. And then each of these small steps, there are lessons from other regions. And that I think science can help with that, to integrate this knowledge.
If I may add. Oh, no, go ahead, Dr. Khan.
Yeah, no, you, Robin, you go ahead. Then after you.
Well, just briefly, I think one of the changes, and this conference, I think, highlights this, is that equity and justice are being integrated at this very seminal stage where research is now taking off to address this issue. And, just looking at the difference between 2 years ago when this conference was happening and the conference organizers recognizing that equity and justice have to be integrated into the way science occurs.
Before we get to Mizan, I believe Catherine did you want to say something? And I know that Mizan has spoken recently. So if you did have something you wanted to say, Catherine, please, it's yours.
I'm happy to go after Mizan. I didn't mean to jump in.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I'll go after him.
Okay.
Now about, I have just 2 bullet comments. One is we need grounded scientific research, disaggregated across space and regions, not some esoteric top-down science that have been discussed about, Bradley most probably discussed about. And about equity and justice, sure. In climate-induced displacement area, this equity and justice are extremely very important issues, nationally as well as globally. But globally still, it is that equity and justice questions are not there. Under the UNFCCC regime, for example, I call it, though for the last 20 years, I have been attending these negotiations as an active participant, negotiator. I call it as a process of active inaction, because multilateral UNFCCC process is so slow, painstakingly slow. So I think we need to have kind of different civil society-led kind of movements for ensuring equity and justice, where citizens must be sensitized, particularly developed country citizens. Because in developing countries, we live with nature, in nature, of nature, and with disasters. But it is these developed country citizens who lack still the awareness to sensitize and hammer their politicians to go for ensuring justice and lead responsibility that they have assumed under all the global regimes, including the UNFCCC. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now, Catherine.
Perfect. And I'll be brief because I know we're winding towards the end. I really like this question. For me, it brings up, what is unique about the topic of managed retreat and this broader big challenge of how we grapple with the changing climate. And, when I think about the conversations I have about retreat, with communities and community organizations, often it's, really railing against the injustices that have added up to who's experienced risk right now. when it's a local government, it's kind of like, can we talk about this privately, not in a public circumstance, but there are a lot of questions about thinking about getting towards long-term and working against the misalignment. When it's FEMA, they say, look, we devolve all of our decisions to the local government for the allocation of funds. So hard to systematically change that. And then when you talk to a journalist, it's basically, well, when adaptation is drainage, there's nothing interesting there, but when retreat, it comes into focus. So I think for this broader question of what does managed retreat add to the landscape for adaptation and science for society, for me, it's really the fact that managed retreat may be exceptional in some of its challenges, but almost any category, it's not unique. It's the intensity, it's the scope, it's the degree to which it requires us to question the status quo. And for me, that's part of why there's such a growing swelling of attention in practice and also in adaptation science, recognizing that if we can figure out some of these challenges for something as hard as relocation and retreat, there are a lot of co-benefits for how we adapt more broadly.
That's great. And I think we have about like 1 minute here. And so I think we have to wrap up and thank everyone. But I believe if I paraphrase a key message that I took from your paper, Catherine, is that even if ultimately a community decides not to retreat, the process of seriously considering it proactively is essentially important too, just in terms of putting the entire adaptation process in that valuable context. And so thank you all, again, for all the weeks and months of effort that you helped put into this issue, and all for talking to the audience today about it here. And have a great rest of the conference, and we'll see you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Very much.
Thank
Good
you.
night. Good.
Yep.